Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Craig Shirley.
Good evening, everyone. My name is John Highbush. Can you hear me okay? Great. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Reagan Foundation, and I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening, this rainy evening, in honor of our men and women in uniform who protect us and defend our freedom around the world. If you please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started tonight, I want to introduce a special guest who's come to us all the way from the great state of Virginia, and that would be the wife of Craig Shirley, Zareen. Zareen, if you please stand and be recognized. Thanks for coming, Zareen. Well, I have no doubt you can imagine that when someone from the general public or the media or historians or book authors or politicians, just about anyone, when they have a question about the life and times of Ronald Reagan, our 40th president, they will oftentimes call or write or visit the Reagan Library, naturally. Why not? Many of you know that we literally sit on top of over 66 million documents and over 65,000 artifacts dedicated to the memory and legacy of President Reagan, his 94 years of life on this earth. So we consider ourselves experts when it comes to answering questions about a man who Americans often say they admire as much as President George Washington or President Lincoln. But where do the experts go when the experts have a question about Ronald Reagan? Well, I'll tell you where they go, at least I know where I certainly go, and that's to Craig Shirley, our speaker for this evening. I'm sure that many of you have come because it's not often that you get a chance to hear from really a world-leading authority, a true historian on President Reagan. And you ask, well, okay, how much of an authority? So I would say, let's examine the evidence. So I have before me 4 remarkable books on the life and times of Ronald Reagan. There's no other author in the world that has ever put together a compendium of research and remarkable writing on Ronald Reagan that Craig Shirley has. There just isn't. They're all wonderful books, and they represent literally decades of work, study by a historian who's done the utmost to be thorough and to be true to his subject. It's an incredible task and something Craig really ought to be congratulated for. I've no doubt that when Craig and I sit to talk in just a minute, I want to make sure we give you the chance to ask a question or two that you might have about President Reagan, so feel free to raise it. But what has our attention this evening is yet another piece of history offered up by Craig, this time a book about someone by the name of Newt Gingrich. While not as famous as Ronald Reagan, I have to say that Newt is not a great distant second. And as Craig has said about the subject of his new book, Citizen Newt, there are very, very few political figures in America who have so dominated public discourse over a period of about 4 decades. As I sit with Craig, we're going to discuss why that is and perhaps learn about another book or two that Craig might have planned for the future. So with that, if you would, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm Reagan Library welcome to best-selling author, a true historian, and may I very proudly say my friend, Craig Shirley.
There, okay. I'm on the left.
Yeah, you're on my, but you're on my right.
That's the important thing.
Well, Craig, great to have you here. Thanks for
Thank you, John.
traveling all the way from the
Yeah.
other side of the United States.
I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Yeah. Okay, Craig, let's get started. Before we get into Newt Gingrich, I thought it would be, because you're a world authority on Ronald Reagan, I want to ask you a question that's often put to me by the media, and I'm sure to you as well, and that is, if you give us a brief comparison, if you will, between your vision of who Ronald Reagan was versus our President Trump today.
You know, Reagan's longtime aide, Marty Anderson, who passed away several years ago, who was a true scholar in his own right and an intellectual, he once estimated that Reagan's IQ was at 175 or even higher. And this is of years of studying the man. People don't realize, I don't think, I mean, you do obviously, but how much he read. You know, how much, a book a week, 4 newspapers a day, how much he wrote, how much he met with scholars of the left and the right, how much he was, it's interesting, is that most men reach a point in their life at about, I'd say about 40 years of age, where they have a settled view of the world, and that becomes their worldview for the rest of their lives. Reagan was different. Reagan was dynamic. The Reagan of 1980 was vastly different. At 65 years of age, 69 years of age, was vastly different than the Reagan of 3 decades earlier. He was constantly evolving. And so, for instance, is that, whether it's on tax cuts or SDI or Soviet relations or whatever, he's much more evolved, much more thoughtful, much more respective, much more reflective than most men his age, and certainly than he was, say, 3 decades earlier. I don't get this sense. I mean, Reagan actually thought about things. You read his speeches, go back and read his speeches, look at his speeches, and they're tutorials. He's quoting Paine and Locke and Jefferson and Madison and Franklin and the framers and the founders, and going back to Aristotle. It's quite remarkable. And most of those speeches he did himself. Is that because he was constantly reading and thinking about things and articulating. I think that Reagan, his 2 favorite philosophers clearly were Thomas Paine and Alexander Solzhenitsyn. But it's interesting because although Paine was clearly a child of the Enlightenment, believed in individual rights, freedom, dignity, privacy, Solzhenitsyn does believe these things, but he gives a speech in 1979 at Harvard University in which he eviscerates the Enlightenment because it replaced God at the center of the universe with man. And Reagan in 1980, he uses a curious phrase in his acceptance speech in Detroit. He doesn't say, we all say man and God. He uses the phrase man with God, which I think is an important distinction. And I think that what Reagan was able to do was to synthesize the Enlightenment position of Paine and Locke and others and blend it with Solzhenitsyn's view so that to Reagan, if man was at the center of the universe as a God-inspired individual, then God was there with him, so that there's no contradiction between the two. So this is how he's able to talk about the spiritual individual, but also about the individual, the free individual determining his own destiny.
Somehow, I think you're not going to be able to give a description of President Trump in the same fashion.
No. I will say this, is that Trump is, Gorsuch was a conservative judicial appointment, is that he has instituted tax cuts. He is promoting strong national defense. So I won't say that he is a Reaganite. He's following Reagan's path that Reagan created for the Republican Party. These are all issues that are totally contrary to, say, Nixon's view of the world, or previous, Republican presidents, Gerald Ford's view of the world. I mean, they all embraced détente and coexistence and things like that. Reagan introduced a new paradigm, which is the defeat of the Soviet Union. tax cuts were not a canon of the Republican Party, they were a canon of the Democratic Party. In 1971, Senators Walter Mondale and Senator Ted Kennedy proposed legislation for massive personal cuts in income taxes as a means of jump-starting the economy. The Nixon administration says, no, that would be irresponsible. We're going to prime the pump with massive federal spending. The role reversal of the two parties brought about by Reagan is astonishing. Is that even on abortion, a lot of scholars will tell you is that before Roe v. Wade crystallized in 1971, is that they would tell you is that a goodly number of Democrats, because of the heavy Catholic dominance of the Democratic Party and up until that time, is that the Democratic Party may have been more pro-life than the Republican Party. The Republican Party, there was a strong, I remember early days of CPAC years ago, there was vigorous debate between the libertarian right and the Christian right over what should be the proper position of the Republican Party. Should it be, pro-choice, or should it be pro-abortion or pro-life? Well, we know the pro-life side won, but it took a long, arduous process before the Republican Party moved to that position.
So spin to the present day. Let's talk about tweets for a second. We certainly know they're a tool of President Trump. If Ronald Reagan had the ability in his time to tweet, to use technology in that fashion, do you think that he would?
Reagan loved technology. Reagan is that commercial radio in the 1930s was a new phenomenon. Reagan mastered it. Talking pictures in the late 30s was a new phenomenon. Reagan mastered it. Television was a new phenomenon in the 1950s. Reagan mastered it. Later, sound bites, press conferences, speeches, all those other things that represent modern, and then going back to the radio broadcasts that he reintroduced as President of the United States. So he loved technology, but he would be using Facebook and tweet and Twitter any way he could get his message out. But he wouldn't be saying the things that Donald Trump is saying. Is that he'd be sending out quotes from Thoreau and not quotes from porn stars or something.
Final Trump-Reagan question, and we'll get on to Newt and the subject of your book. Do you see any parallels? You referenced the strong defense element.
Yes.
Do you kind of imagine Ronald Reagan and the stance and the way he spoke about communism in the Soviet Union? Do you see the same sort of approach between Trump and the issues of Iran and North Korea?
No, because what Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union was a philosophical one. It was based on the issue of human freedom, individual rights, and all those things that I talked about before, and the fact that the Soviets were winning the Cold War in 1980, is that they had just invaded Afghanistan. They were ahead of us in missile defense. They had Cuba. They'd just taken over Nicaragua. Southeast Asia had fallen to communism. Is that the Soviets, were in every measurable way, were winning the Cold War as of 1980. We were losing it. And Reagan saw the inevitable, if it played out, that Khrushchev was going to be proven right, that the East would bury the West. And that was on his mind all the time, for all 8 years of his presidency, including the much misreported Simpson-Mazzoli Act on immigration. Is that because everything Reagan did, part of the reason for the tax cuts, Reagan gave a talk to a group of conservatives in 1981, and he said that, the tax cuts are about stimulating the economy and jobs and things like this, but he said, really, it's about reorganizing man's relationship to the state. Now, A, that's a very profound thought, and B, who in politics, certainly not Donald Trump, talks like that anymore. But he recognized that power had been flowing from the citizenry and the states to the national government since the time of the New Deal, and he wanted to reverse that flow and send it back, which enhanced individual freedom and was in fact, in the early days of his administration, it was called New Federalism. They dropped it. I don't know why they dropped it. They should have stuck with it, but it was about sending power and authority back to the states and ultimately the individual.
Let's get to Newt. Why go from Reagan to Newt Gingrich? What gave you the idea that Newt was a figure that should be studied and written about like this?
He asked me to write the book. Which he did, is that, there've been a lot of books written about
It sounds
Gingrich.
like Newt.
Yeah, precisely, yes. I mean, Reagan would never say, would you write a book about me? But Gingrich approached me about writing the book. But I had to set several conditions, which is that he could not dictate any editorial content whatsoever. He could suggest things, but at no time could he have any input whatsoever into what I wrote. It had to be those conditions. I would interview him, have unlimited access to him, his people, and his papers, but at no time could he dispute or disagree with anything or suggest any alternatives to what I wrote. It would be occasionally I would send him a chapter or a paragraph. I say, do I have this right? Because my notes are kind of fuzzy. I didn't ask you about this, and he would answer. But to his credit, he never ever tried to change anything, and he would answer, truthfully as best he could about some content of the book. But is that you mentioned it, and you're exactly right, John. Is that if you think about American history, he's been on the national stage since the 1970s, since the late 70s, and he's still on the national stage. He's still giving advice. He's still writing. People are still seeking his opinion. He's still articulating his philosophy. I think, for my own taste, I think he's too close to Trump. Is that I think he needed to establish himself as a more independent authority, but that's his career, not mine.
I'm a little surprised that, given how visible he was with the Trump campaign and
yes.
how much he supported him, that he didn't end up in the Trump administration in some formal way.
Yeah, so am I. I would have thought he would have been a counselor to the president or something like this. Is that, Newt is kind of like, when it comes to administration, he's like the little girl with the curl. When he's good, he's very good. When he's bad, he's horrid. Is that he's a thinker. He writes memos and he gives excellent advice and things like that. But as far as directing staff on a daily basis and setting policy, the only time he really, really, buckled down and got people focused and got his staff focused was on the Contract with America in the '94 campaign, which was completely revolutionary. It's just earth-shaking, never happened before in American history, hasn't happened since. That you have that type of political earthquake in an off-year election.
Well, let's spin the clock back a little bit on Newt. How did he get interested in politics in the first place? How did he get a start?
He was kind of a nerdy kid. He was a nerdy kid. Is that he tried when he was a kid, he played football, but he said he was mostly used for a tackling dummy. He wasn't very coordinated, but he was bright. And he was energetic. When he was a kid, he got the Harrisburg mayor he started a letter writing campaign to create a zoo in Harrisburg. He later moved to Georgia after his parents got divorced, and his father was career Army, and he moved to Georgia and ended up teaching at West Georgia College. But this is a guy who was, from an early time, was interested in politics, world history, current affairs. These are the things that animated him. So, it seemed kind of natural for him to go into academia, and then once he's in academia, he realizes, it's very frustrating in academia, because you can only affect your class, but you can't affect the world, and he wanted more. So he just gravitates toward politics. And in the Watergate year of 1974, now he's down in Georgia, he's a professor at West Georgia State, very popular with the students. I read the reviews, I went through all of his papers, thousands of documents, and without exception, all of the students give him just extraordinary reviews. Just, great teacher, wonderful professor, great lectures. One person complained that he wasn't getting enough reading material assigned by Professor Gingrich. Yeah, but he, to go into politics, you have to have a degree of self-confidence. You have to believe in yourself. You have to believe that you can do good things, or at least just believe in yourself. But so he runs in the Watergate year of 1974 against the incumbent Jack. Who's been entrenched, been there for 30 years. He's a yellow dog Democrat. He's kind of a Jim Crow Democrat, and he's outspent. He's been there. Sometimes he doesn't even have Republican opposition. He's so strong. But he comes audaciously close. In the Watergate year, in the yellowest dog state of Georgia, he only loses by 6,000 votes. This is astonishing because Republicans are losing nationwide. They're losing everything. After actually the 74 election is that only one state in the country had Republican control of the governorship and both legislatures, and that's Kansas. 49 other states had near or total Democratic control. Is that there were states in the South that didn't even have elected Republicans. I think it was Mississippi, didn't have one elected Republican to any statewide or state legislative office.
So then Newt tried and failed in 74.
Tried and failed in
His
74.
next race was when?
76.
Right.
Tried and failed again.
Right.
Loses by the same 6,000 vote margin, which is, you know, most men would just drive you crazy. But he's campaigning constantly. He's even when he loses, he's giving speeches. He's meeting Kiwanis clubs. He's going to pancake breakfasts. He's going, and there's a healthy African American population there in that district at the time, and he's going to Black Baptist churches, and he's going to Black social clubs, and he's actively reaching out. Something that no Republican, you would think would do. Well, certainly the Democrat, because he was kind of a Jim Crow guy.
And then 78,
In
third time's a charm.
Third
right?
time's a charm. He wins in 78, which is a kind of a minor Republican year. Republicans picked up, 15, 20 in the House.
This was off year, Carter.
Off year Carter, right, yeah, right. So he wins. And even before he's sworn in, he's making national news by going after corruption in the Democratic Party.
Yeah, he was there 2 years before.
Jack Flynn.
Jack
Flynn. I had a senior moment, I'm sorry.
2 years before Reagan arrives in Washington. Would you describe Newt in that 78 through 80 period? Was he already a revolutionary?
Yes, yeah. He was born a revolutionary. I mean, he really was. He was always anti-establishment. He was always challenging the Republican Party establishment and certainly the Democratic Party establishment. And that's why the media liked him so much, why he was so quotable, why he was on national television all the time, and why he was quoted in the newspapers all the time, because he was very, very quotable and always revolutionary. He's so revolutionary. Before he's sworn in January '79, there was a Democratic congressman from Detroit named Charles Diggs, who was very, very corrupt. He was taking kickbacks from the staff in the amount of tens of thousands of dollars, and just very dirty. And Newt starts a campaign to have him kicked out of Congress.
As a freshman.
Before he's a freshman. And this actually gains national attention, national publicity. And he eventually does force Diggs out, and then Diggs goes to prison. Then he goes after Freddie St. Germain, who was a Democratic congressman from Rhode Island, who was the chairman of the House Banking Committee, who used, forgive the bad pun, but he used the House Banking Committee as his own piggy bank. And he was taking kickbacks and bribes from banks that he was supposed to be regulating as chairman of the House Banking Committee. So he goes after him. So now he's 2-0 going after corrupt Democrats. Then he goes after Jim Wright. Jim Wright is the Speaker of the House.
Now this is 1980.
1979, 79, 80. And then Wright resigns, and it takes 3 years to get Wright out.
Yeah.
He resigns, I think, in
83,
80,
84.
yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
Wright is the Speaker of the House, succeeds Tip O'Neill as the Speaker of the House. He's third in line for the presidency of the United States. This is a very powerful man. And by the way, Reagan didn't like Jim Wright. No, if you were a Republican, you just didn't like Jim Wright because he was so partisan and so odious. Reagan actually, in his diaries, called Jim Wright a stormtrooper. I mean, he didn't like him. But this guy is, Cadillac deals, Cadillac dealers in his district, shady oil deals, shady cattle deals.
Well, what got him was the book deal, wasn't it?
Exactly, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Because he gets a huge advance for this book that nobody wants, and then he gets like the Teamsters to buy 100,000. If only you and I could do something like that.
Yeah.
But the Teamsters, buy 100,000 copies of his book, and of course he gets the royalties from the sale of the book. So it looks legitimate, but it's actually very, very dirty. And finally, is that the amount of evidence just weighs right down and forces.
And this was what gives Newt the reputation as a giant killer,
Yes,
right?
absolutely,
He's
yes.
able to rid
Right.
the Democrats of
Yes.
their Speaker of the House,
Yes.
right? Now,
Right.
at the
But he
sa-
goes after one other Democratic congressman and gets him too, who is Tony Coelho from here in California.
Yeah.
So now he's 4-0, going after corrupt Democrats and forcing them out of office.
Now, at the same time, tell me, how did Newt adapt to Ronald Reagan coming to Washington? Did he immediately become a Reagan revolutionary?
Yeah, yeah. He had started out. He used to tell me, well, he supported Nelson Rockefeller in 1968 because his favorite Republican wasn't in the race, Ronald Reagan, which is kind of a white lie. Is that he was evolving as a Republican toward a conservative, but he was very much a Nelson Rockefeller type Republican in '68, and Reagan did run in '68. But he quickly evolved over the '70s into a more conservative Republican. He wrote a piece for the Baltimore Sun in 1974. Now this is when he's a college professor and he's running for office, but he writes a piece for the Baltimore Sun saying how former California Governor Ronald Reagan should take on Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination in 1968. And it's the first, as far as I can tell, John, it's the first time that there was somebody had taken a public position advocating Reagan challenge Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, it was.
He's a giant killer. He goes 4-0, 5-0. I remember having worked on the Hill at the time and watched that ascendancy. And now I left to do other things. But talk about this time frame in the early 90s. I mean, to when Newt Gingrich, tell me, how was it possible he went from this backbencher Republican
Right.
taking shots at these corrupt Democrats to becoming the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives?
That's a long process. By the way, when he was in Congress, when he was a freshman and sophomore, there was a back part of the House that was called Redneck Row, and that's where he sat. But he first of all, is that what is remarkable is how much Bob Michael, as you may remember, was the House Minority Leader of the for many years for the Republicans. Very nice guy, but he was not a fighter. You know, he was more interested in going golfing with Tip O'Neill and singing Christmas carols with Tip O'Neill than he was in organized opposition. Whereas Gingrich, it wasn't just Gingrich, it was Jack Kemp, it was Bob Walker, it was Dan Quayle, and it was a dozen other revolutionary, Bob Livingston, revolutionary young Republicans, real, Tip O'Neill used to dismiss them as Reagan's robots or the nutcases or the screwballs or whatever. But they did battle on a daily basis against the Democratic establishment using special orders. But what is also interesting is I didn't realize, John, until I got into this book, how much these guys carried the Reagan administration's water in the House because Bob Michael just wasn't, the fight wasn't in him. And these guys were just tearing, so on aid to the Nicaraguan Contras, on tax cuts, on SDI, on South Africa, on apartheid, it's just that they were the ones who were really fighting for the Reagan agenda on Capitol Hill, much more so than Bob Walker was.
Right, so this gives Newt the Reagan legitimacy.
Yes.
He's perceived as one of the true leaders that
Absolutely.
got behind Reagan, and
Yeah.
then he vaunts from that position to one of credibility as a potential leader within the party.
Yes and no. I mean, people fear him in Washington, and the national media sought him out for interviews and quotes and things like that. But there's a certain amount of the Republican establishment which is terrified of him, and there's a certain amount of the national media which just has nothing but contempt for him. But he just sloughs this off. It doesn't bother him. At least it doesn't bother him outwardly. And I think that was partly because of his childhood. It's just that we all learn from different experiences. People often ask me, is that how was Reagan able to fend off the vicious attacks? And by the way, he did get viciously attacked just as much as Trump. Reagan was also viciously attacked by CBS, NBC, ABC, the Washington Post and New York Times. And the only thing I can figure is that, first of all, growing up poor during the Depression probably gave him a thicker skin. I think also too is that he made 56 movies in his career, and some of them, quite frankly, weren't very good, and he was criticized for them. They got bad reviews or something else, and so he developed a pretty thick hide, so that later in his presidency, the attacks didn't get through to him because he was too focused on what he wanted to get done. So he didn't. Trump never, experienced this type of attacks before, so Trump takes it all personally. I don't think Reagan, it certainly didn't reflect in his diaries, except there was several times, like for instance, there was Republican Senator Lowell Weicker, maybe some of you remember, he was a very liberal Republican from Connecticut, and Reagan wrote in his diaries once after a meeting with Lowell Weicker that he was a schmuck and I mean, he's, just a pain in the neck, and used some other superlatives in describing Lowell Weicker. But other than that, he was pretty, he slaughtered off, at least publicly.
So back to Newt. For one reason or another, he's viewed as a true leader.
Yes.
He's elected to the speakership of the House. He sits as speaker from 1995 to 1999,
right.
4 years. How could someone who spent that much time in the backbenches building a reputation, becoming speaker, the leader of the Republicans, not last longer than 4 years as a speaker?
I asked him that. He burned himself out. He pursued too many lost causes, pursued too many tangents. He regretted, not to make judgments on it, but the Clinton impeachment really stopped things because, like it or not, Clinton, for his political survival, went along with much of the Republican contract. He signed welfare reform, they balanced the budget, freedom to farm, reforms on Capitol Hill. There was 9 out of 10 of the items in the Republican contract were enacted, many with Bill Clinton's signature. And Bill Clinton knew that if he was going to survive in 1996, he had to move to the center because he was leaving himself open. But impeachment, because there were lots of other reforms that he and Gingrich were talking about. And Clinton, at the time, you look back and say Clinton was on economics and a lot of other issues was not, I would never describe him as conservative, but he wasn't a wild-eyed liberal. He wasn't a free-spending liberal.
He triangulated his way into
precisely.
issues,
Yes,
right?
exactly. But all that was set by the wayside by the impeachment, and Newt always regretted the impeachment from the standpoint that more things weren't done for the American people because the impeachment was such a distraction for everything.
Yeah,
everything
well,
ground to a halt.
Yeah, so in some respects, I think your point would be that while the Monica Lewinsky scandal and the blue dress and all of that was an attempt to bring down Clinton, in some respects it helped to bring down Newt in a way, right?
Yes, yeah.
Explain that.
Well, I think it came home for the Republicans in the election of 1998 because, Clinton was besieged on impeachment, and Monica Lewinsky, as you said, and all these other scandals. And I remember going to a Republican watch party in Washington in 1998, and the Republicans lost 5 seats in the House and lost a couple in the Senate. Everybody was aghast because they just figured, Republicans are going to pick up a couple dozen seats in the House and pick up some seats in the Senate because Clinton has been weakened, because Democrats are embarrassed about impeachment, they're not going to turn out, and it was just the opposite. And I think that really brought it home to roost how much the American people didn't want this investigation to continue.
Right,
and that really weakened Newt because he was predicting, big Republican pickups. And so when 98 turned sour on the Republicans, is that he lost a lot of credibility with his own constituency.
Yeah, his own party, I guess. A number
yeah.
of the people, his backbenchers saw
Yes.
the whole Lewinsky impeachment thing as a distraction.
Yes.
Away from them accomplishing things that they wanted to get done.
Right.
Okay, so now later, much later, Newt makes a run for the presidency.
You could call it that.
Yeah, so, okay, to that precise point, I remember well here at the Reagan Library when Newt Gingrich was here for a debate
Right.
in the Republican primaries.
Right.
And I think at the time, maybe it was the first of the Republican debates that was held here. But by the time we got to the fifth, sixth debate, Newt, who had been running 1-2% in the polls nationally, now was in the double digits and was moving up, and
Yes,
at
he
some
was.
point for a brief period of time was actually the front runner
He
for
was.
the presidency, right?
And he won the South Carolina primary.
And so why was Newt Gingrich not elected president of the United States?
Because he didn't pivot when he should have. Reagan in 1976, after he'd lost the first 5 primaries, he pivoted in North Carolina and developed the Panama Canal as an issue. And that revived his campaign and sent him to Kansas City, where he almost won the nomination against Gerald Ford. Is that when a politician, you have to recognize is that, and your aides have to tell this too, and he wasn't surrounded, Newt was never surrounded by good political operatives or good consultants. But when the sunlight is on you for that one brief shining moment, you got to seize the advantage. You got to say what it is you stand for, where it is you want to lead the country, where it is you want to lead the American people, and how you're going to do it. And you have to do that in a concise fashion. And he didn't. He won the South Carolina primaries. Reagan and I were there in South Carolina that night. He invited us to come down there they were pretty sure they were going to win. And we go into the ballroom, we're expecting him, now because all the national media is there, live on CNN and Fox and MSNBC and Provident, everybody's worldwide. And he gives this disjointed, really, I mean, we're just staring at each other and said, what is he saying? Is that it just, when the sunlight was on him, he didn't seize the day. He did not seize the advantage. And I think that it then the cards just played themselves out after that, because he squandered away the one moment that he had to strike at the king, to strike at Mitt Romney. And then Romney had massive amounts of money. Newt was never, disciplined. Like I said before, he was never a good administrator, and he had never built up a war chest, and so he couldn't fight back. And so the cards just played themselves out. But he didn't develop a signature issue for himself or a set of issues for himself. He was trying to run as the conservative alternative to Romney, which is a great position to be in, is in a Republican nomination process. But you got to articulate what your conservatism is for the 21st century, and he didn't do that. It was very frustrating for us to watch him from the sidelines, because Zuri and I worked on so many campaigns, and we knew what it is, what a candidate needs to do to win the campaign.
Do you think that Newt would admit that
Yes.
he missed the moment?
Yes, yeah, we talked about that, and he agreed. He agreed. Is that he got up there and he was so ill prepared and he's so star-struck because he won South Carolina, but they'd been thinking about it for he knew for a couple days he was going to have a good chance to win South Carolina, and then he wins it. He wins it big. It wasn't a squeaker either. It was a sizable victory. Romney should have been mortally wounded. Plus the fact he had history on his side, because every Republican nominee up to that point, if they won the South Carolina primary, won their nomination. It was that much of a bellwether state, just as New Hampshire used to be. But he didn't seize the moment, and instead, he tried to spread himself out over, because the next round of primaries was over 12 states, and he didn't have the money to compete. I will say other thing, in Newt's defense, he also had Santorum running to Romney's right. So he and Santorum, were inhaling all the conservative primary votes, and Romney had the more establishment moderate votes. So he had the left all to himself. And there is still, today, there's still a sizable number of moderate Republican primary voters.
Mm-hmm. What's Newt doing today? I don't mean this day, but what's Newt doing?
He's in Rome. Callista's ambassador to the Vatican, a position created by Ronald Reagan in 1981. First ambassador to the Vatican was appointed by Reagan. He's doing some, he's a kind of an advisor without portfolio to Trump. He's still doing his Fox thing. He's doing a teaching thing on the internet. He's 71 years old, and he's still as active today as he was 30 years ago.
Do you think
he's still writing op-eds, he's still appearing, he's still giving speeches.
Is it fair to say that his influence has waned now, that he's spread thin enough without a portfolio? And as a result, we're not likely to see him be as dominant a force again in American politics, or no?
As a dominant force, yes. But as an influencer, no. Now he's kind of an elder statesman, but he's still sought after. He's still asked to speak. He's still speaking out.
It's interesting. Do you think he would admit that he's an elder statesman at this point?
No. In his mind, he's still a baby boomer.
Interesting. Very interesting. We've got a few minutes to entertain questions that you might have. Hopefully, one or two of you have been thinking about a question as we've been going through. I see we have a few in the back. If you could, we're just going to hand you a microphone. First, we have one right here, and then we'll go to you. Thank you.
What's his name? Schweiker?
Dick Schweiker?
Right. You said that. Didn't Reagan, as I recall, Reagan put him like
On a ticket in '76.
Yeah.
Yes.
That just seems interesting that he didn't like him. I don't know. I just vaguely remember.
No. That happened a lot. This is that Lowell Weicker and Dick Schweiker were two different Republicans. No, that's quite all right. Because actually, when Reagan picked Dick Schweiker in 1976, a lot of people confused him and denounced Reagan for picking that liberal from Connecticut. And they said, no, I didn't pick Lowell Weicker, I picked Dick Schweiker. So it's all right. It happened a lot in politics. Yeah, but actually, the Reagans and the Schweikers were quite close. Reagan picked Schweiker at Kansas City as a last-minute means of trying to probably lose some uncommitted delegates from the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York delegations to gain the nomination over Gerald Ford. And it worked partially in that for 3 weeks it froze the situation so that Ford couldn't claim, because it was about 3 weeks before the convention. But then the second part didn't play out. It didn't probably lose the delegates they thought it would. But it was still, it was a master stroke that only John Sears, who was then Reagan's campaign manager, could have come up with.
Yes, sir.
I've been mesmerized by reading Robert Caro and the Years of Lyndon B. Johnson. Are there any authors that have influenced you and that you really like? And also, what is the next book that you would want to write about, if you could?
You know, Caro is a master. Caro's written, the gentleman's absolutely right, he's working on his 4th volume on Lyndon Johnson. Caro actually, to get a feel for what Johnson's life was like in the Texas Hill Country in West Texas, he actually went out there and slept on the ground just to try to get a feel for what Johnson was going through in the Depression era. But that's the type of research, and that's the type of work Caro does. He's a master. He's written the definitive books on Lyndon Johnson, and hopefully the last one will be finished. Who's influenced me? Schlesinger, his book especially on Andrew Jackson, certainly McCullough, John Meacham, trying to think of some others.
What about his second question? What's your next 3 books?
My next 3 books. I am currently working on a book called Honored Madam, about Mary Ball Washington, George Washington's mother. Nobody's ever written a definitive biography of Mary Ball Washington. She's a fascinating figure of history. She's in many ways America's first lady. Is that she's been very, very badly abused by history, when she first passed away, there were kind of hagiographies, little children's books written about her. But then as time evolved, is that they became much, much harsher. So the image that emerged was a part mommy dearest and part helicopter mother. But it's it's much more complicated than that. And I'm calling my book Honored Madam, because that's how he always addressed his letters to his mother, Honored Madam. Now, there was contentious relationship, there's no doubt about it, between the mother and son. But there was also a lot of love and admiration. So it's a far more complex relationship than has been presented currently. My book after that, I actually got the idea from Sir Martin Gilbert, who was the official historian for Winston Churchill. And one of his books on Churchill was called The Search for Churchill. Try to bring people's understanding back to Churchill. I'm doing a book called The Search for Reagan, because Donald Trump and Fox News and others are misunderstanding Ronald Reagan. And I hear, John hears it all the time. I hear it occasionally, but Reagan did this, Reagan did that. Well, it's not true. It's not true. It's not true. So I'm doing this this book. I've got. You asked me which 3 books. I've got a list, a legal tab on my bedstand of 26 books I want to write. And every time I think of a new book, I write it down, but I think I'm probably going to expire before my list does. There is one other book which Zareen really wants me to write, and I do want to write, which is about Dr. Howard Snyder, who was Dwight Eisenhower's personal physician. I come into possession of all his documents. He was Dwight Eisenhower's physician from 1941 until Eisenhower died in 1969. He was there all 8 years in the White House. During the heart attack, the ileitis, the strokes, everything else like this. And a lot of history was made there because, like for instance, Eisenhower, you think of I Like Ike and Smiling Ike, but Ike had a horrible, horrible temper, explosive temper. And I guess part of it was fueled, he used to smoke 4 packs of filterless Luckies a day. Yeah. And Snyder said, he said, you've got to quit this. You've got to quit the smoking. And by the way, you got to change your diet and you got to take up a hobby, which is why Eisenhower took up painting. And actually, he was quite good as a painting landscapes, mostly with watercolors, but he also did pencil sketches. And you go online, and he would sketch, during cabinet meetings, people's hands or the necks or whatever. And he was actually quite good. He was probably the best of all the doodlers, of all the presidential doodlers. He was probably the best. Of course, Nixon just wrote, when he was doing it, he was circles and squares. And, Freud would have a ball with him, right? So anyway, Dr. Howard Snyder, I think, because they made so much history, let me just close out by saying, presidential medicine was shrouded in secrecy from the time of Washington until the time of Eisenhower. Nobody, it's kind of a myth to say that nobody knew about FDR being in a wheelchair, but the vast majority of Americans didn't know that the president was in a wheelchair. They didn't know about Wilson's stroke. They didn't know that Grover Cleveland had cancer of the jaw and had a surgery to replace it with an India rubber prosthetic jaw. They didn't know about Abraham Lincoln's bouts with melancholia or Thomas Jefferson's bouts with depression. This was all shrouded in secrecy. It was only after Eisenhower and since, with the exception of John Kennedy and Bill Clinton. But generally speaking, presidential health has been announced to the American public in real time, and it started with Dwight Eisenhower. And that's actually his first executive decision as President of the United States, with the advice of Howard Snyder, which was my health condition will be made known to the American public. So when he had his heart attack in '55, the American people knew about it right away. When he had his attack of ileitis in Denver in '57, the American people knew about it right away. So, but there was a lot of other things too, these papers, because part of the thing was that he had to hold Mamie Eisenhower's hand, because the rumors of the Eisenhower affair with Kay Summersby, who was his British driver during World War II in London, had gotten back to Mamie in Washington, and she was fit to be tied. So his diary talks about how he had to sit down with her and explain it wasn't true and calm her nerves and things like that. So there's a lot of personal, this doctor was not just a doctor, he was probably Eisenhower's closest friend. So there's a lot of unwritten history here, so I'm very, very intrigued in doing that. I've got to do a book on the '84 Reagan campaign, which is yet to be written. So that give you a sample of what I'm working on. So, like I said, my list of books is going to outlast my list.
Yes, we have a question right over here. She's bringing me the microphone. Sir.
Since I have the opportunity, I want to ask my Reagan question. I have a book at home that I'm pretty sure the title is Reagan in His Own Hand. And my understanding is
That's
that
excellent.
well before he was governor or president, that he actually had spent a lot of time writing, working his way through various kinds of political issues.
Yes.
And people weren't aware of it. And when I read it, I thought, this is remarkable that a person could have done this much thinking on the subject before he even got into office.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There are two marvelous books, Reagan in His Own Hand and then A Life in Letters, which were edited by Marty and Annalise Anderson, who were both close friends and aides to Reagan, and Kyron Skinner, who is a superb professor at the Hoover Institute. And you're absolutely right, is that in those books is that you can see the development of Reagan's thinking, if you take it chronologically, how he moved from, what he used to call himself as, he wasn't a bleeding heart liberal, he was a hemophiliac liberal, to a time where he actually called himself a libertarian conservative. There was a famous interview with CBS up at the ranch in 1975. Mike Wallace, when he was getting ready to run against Gerald Ford, and he called himself, in this interview, he called himself a libertarian conservative, and Wallace said, I don't understand. And so Reagan, with great detail and great verve and intellectual firepower, explains the philosophical basis for libertarianism and its relationship to American conservatism. So, and this is a man who is constantly, you're absolutely right, he read a lot, he listened a lot, and he wrote a lot. And those are all intellectual exercises.
Well put. Any other questions? Here we go. I think this might be our last question.
Hi, Craig. Thanks for being here
You
on a
bet.
rainy night. As a docent here for going on 9 years, there's always a few things that you just never can quite figure out. First of all, I have to tell you, I love Newt. He's always exciting. I like to go on YouTube and watch some of his talks at various universities and what have you. This question is about Ronald Reagan. And in 1974, he bought Rancho del Cielo, I believe, and in 1975, he sold his Malibu ranch.
Right.
In 1979, he sold a Pacific Palisades home. And I thought, I always wondered about that. It was like burning the ship, so no one can return to the mainland, right? What was going on? I know this is very personal. You may not even have an answer. I don't have one. What was going on in his mind? Was he thinking, I'm going to run for president one last time because I'm almost 70 years old in 1979, and if I don't make it, I'm going to Rancho del Cielo and the heck with it, and that's the end of it.
Well, he may have been thinking that, but I'm not sure Mrs. Reagan would have agreed. We all know he loved the ranch. And all 8 years of his presidency, his official residence was Refugio Road. And that was his voting precinct, and that's where he went to vote. There was a Santa Barbara precinct that he voted in 1980, and then it was moved by 84 to a little town on the other side of where the ranch was. But that was his official residence for all 8 years of his presidency. I don't know why he sold Pacific Palisades. I mean, maybe John knows more about that. I know about selling the Malibu ranch, but it was just a question of why have two ranches when you got one with 650 acres.
I did read somewhere where it showed Ronnie and Patty, they weren't happy about it at all.
Well, there are a lot of things they weren't happy about it.
Great. Well, I want to, on behalf of this great audience here, say Thank you again, Craig, for coming. It's always a pleasure to have you here. I meant what I said about where do the experts call the experts, and it's on Ronald Reagan, and certainly the topic of his newest book on Newt Gingrich, it's you call Craig Shirley. And it's just been an honor to have you here, Craig, and we just really want to say thank you so much for coming.
Well, it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Ken. Thank you so much.